Welcome to the Cafe Culture podcast, a season of discussions on culture, politics, philosophy and science.
This event was recorded on the 20th of May 2013 when Christine Borland discussed a meeting place, a year as Baltic Professor.
Hi folks, thanks for coming tonight. I was really nervous about speaking without any images. I think it's the first time that I've ever done that. So I'm really glad that it's such an intimate audience tonight. When you see me frantically looking at my computer, that's when I'd usually be looking at my images to remind me what I was saying. So first of all, I'm the Baltic Professor. What is the Baltic Professor? Basically, I'm a Professor of Contemporary Art at Northumbria University. The bit that makes that in any way new, of course, is the Baltic connection. A new partnership was formed several years ago. The name of it is B times NU. So the partnership is between Baltic and Northumbria University. My position was created as part of that partnership. So when I applied for the job, it was a fairly open brief for me to some extent make it up as I go along. So a bit of a dream job based on my own research as an artist. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight will just be what I do and how the position has grown from that point of view. On a day-to-day basis, what I do is liaise with colleagues at Baltic, looking at the research possibilities in the Baltic programme, trying to figure out how we can share those possibilities between the research staff and students at Northumbria University, and also how we can develop a kind of public face for that research. So I've been in post about a year and a half now. So this is an interesting moment to reflect on how that's gone. There's a fairly special thing about my job is that I'm based at a really rather lovely new space called Baltic 39. It's been created, it's a conversion of an old warehouse, and for those of you who haven't been there, it's on 4 floors. Baltic have an exhibition space on the top floor, huge 500 square feet exhibition space. Northumbria University have postgrad space there, PhD students, MA students, about to be MFA students, and also a kind of changing group of undergraduate students. Also, interestingly, for the dynamic of the building, there's 30-odd paying studio holders. So obviously part of what I'm trying to do also is create a kind of synergy between all these stakeholders in the space. There's been, in a year that it's been open, there's only been 3 shows in the Baltic space so far. It is called a project space, but I would say that the identity of that space is still developing. The 3 exhibitions have been a group show called Switch, and 2 by kind of youngish artists, Andrew Miller from Glasgow and Matt Calderwood from London. What we're going to do is I'm going to, through your network, I'm going to just offer a date for anyone who'd like a guided tour of the building. I'll send an email out with a date, and you can come and be shown round by me if you'd like that. So who is Baltic Prof? That's me. Just a little bit about my background, my education. I did my undergraduate at Glasgow School of Art from 1983 to 87. And then I went to the University of Ulster to do my MA from 1998 to 99. So both of those experiences were really formative, brilliant times of change in both of those situations. At Glasgow School of Art, I was part of a brand new course called Environmental Art. It was a transition between a course that had been called Multimedia, but had slightly lost its direction, The new environmental course was encouraging students to think about the context for what they're doing, not necessarily as an art gallery, but to think about public space and to practice the kind of negotiations and liaisons that are necessary to cite a work in public. So we had to do a project every year that would be to cite a temporary work, and that still continues. Being on the MA at Belfast was also incredibly difficult and interesting. When I got there, I realised how naive I was to think about simply making work in this incredible situation of turmoil. I found it really hard to make work, and I was very much drawn towards the ethos of the art school there, which was about performance. I think because things were in such a state of flux constantly in the city, it was very difficult for students to make large sculptures or large painting. Lots and lots of people made performance work, which is quite unique in the UK. When I came back to Glasgow after doing my MA, again, another important sort of thing that I did was to help run an artist-run space called Transmission Gallery. Very empowering, run by a committee of artists, learning about curating and programming, as well as cleaning toilets, and all the other associated things. So in the 20-odd years since then, I've been a full-time artist. I've had part-time jobs. I've had part-time teaching jobs, mostly at Glasgow School of Art. I became a research fellow at Glasgow School of Art, but I definitely wasn't on an academic trajectory. So I've been plucked from the field, as I've found they call it, to this elevated position of professor. So there's been a lot of learning on my feet about academic structures. So my own work as an artist over those years has been multimedia work in sculpture, installation, video and photography. It's been based, as Jennifer said, on interdisciplinary dialogues, working with forensic scientists, ballistic experts, medical educationalists, geneticists, medical historians, amongst others. So I wanted to start by describing a few pieces of work, how they developed, and hopefully you won't be frustrated by the lack of images. But basically, I suppose it gives a really clear, I hope, trajectory towards the reason why someone who's a practicing artist and not an academic would be interested in a position like Baltic Professor. So the first piece of work that I wanted to talk about was called From Life. I made it in 1994, and I always think of it as my first kind of grown-up, proper artist piece of work. The methods and process that I used when I made that piece of work have really stayed with me, and I've continued to refine and explore them in every piece of work that I've made ever since. So the starting point of the work was that I was invited to make an exhibition in a huge space in Glasgow called Tramway. And the first thing I did was spend almost the whole exhibition budget of £1,000 buying a human skeleton. So why did I do that? Several years before, I had been making pieces of work where I was exploring the presence and absence of objects by tracing them in dust and putting them on glass shelves. Okay, here we're getting difficult. I shouldn't describe the work too much, but to get to the point, I wanted to try this with some bones. So I went to the Hunterian Museum at Glasgow University, where I knew of its existence because we'd been encouraged to go there as students and draw, even though the museum itself wasn't publicly accessible. So I went there to say, could I borrow a spine, because I wanted to use it in a sculpture. They couldn't lend me any spines because it was exam time. So when I asked this question, it was only thinking of a plastic spine. But what they did was give me a catalogue, which was all about the availability of bones to buy. There was a price list in this catalogue ranging from 50 pence for a kneecap to £1,000 for a complete skeleton. So that was in about 1990, and that stayed with me for 4 years as a kind of mind-blowing starting place for to make a piece of work. It took me that amount of time to think, well, how on earth could I go about doing this? And when I eventually I thought, the resources to begin this, I went straight to the company and said, got your price list, could I purchase the skeleton? And they said, well, actually, this is one of the last times you'll ever be able to do this. They told me a story with a little bit of prompting, because of course I really wanted to know what was the history of purchasing this bone material. So they told me that this had been a trade with the Asian subcontinent, that's as specific as they got, that had been going on since like the 20s or 30s. But there had recently been an investigation at the source, and now this was going to be stopped. They were only running down what they had in their stores. The other reason for this was now that plastic bones were getting so good that there was no real need to continue using human bone material. So these vague facts were also, incredibly tantalising as a starting point. The space that I was going to exhibit in was a huge space, tramway, an old tram depot in Glasgow, if you don't know the space. Pretty daunting because it's so big, and I didn't actually have an idea in mind of how the piece would look. It was a new thing for me to do, where I would just trust in the process to tell me what the exhibition was going to end up looking like. So the only thing that I knew I had to do that would lead me there was to start documenting everything. So I wrote down the details of the phone call, but when the postman came to my door with the box, so a small cardboard box, just this size, completely innocuous, first thing I started to do was I took the postman's picture. I took the box, took it into my bedroom. It was still kind of student bedsitville. Unpacked it on my bed, started to take pictures, and just try to really feel this moment of opening a box and unpacking a human skeleton that I had purchased. After that, because I was beginning to be a little bit keyed into some structures within Glasgow University via my anatomy department contacts, I ended up in the Department of Forensic Medicine. And I took my skeleton, which is a very, very odd thing to say, but I took it there to see, could I speak to someone who was there to help me on this journey of trying to figure out a story or a narrative or a history for this commodity. So the first person I met, after I had an interesting discussion with the professor there about why I thought they should help me, he agreed, and he introduced me to Professor Sue Black. She wasn't a professor then, but now she's a professor of anatomy and forensic anthropology at Dundee University. Then her job was, as she described to me, to deal with anything that's been dug up in the locale. So she was working as a kind of collaborative post between the university and the police department. So she would provide a very basic description of any pathology on bones that were unidentified that had been handed into the department. So the vast majority of these remained as unidentified, and they weren't logged as missing persons cases. Usually they had been put down to people who were missing, but there was no obvious suspicious cause of death. And as we sort of talked, and she provided the basic identity for this skeleton that I had purchased. As we talked and I tried to figure out why she was helping me, she told me a story that somehow made sense of our relationship. It wasn't a collaboration, but somehow she felt that what I was doing was allowing her to kind of complete a circle, whereby usually what she does is look at these bones, provide a report. The report goes to the police. A long time passes. She puts them in a box under her desk, very much like my anonymous box. The box eventually gets picked up maybe once or twice a year by the police. The file is not opened. It gets taken away to be buried in an unmarked grave. And there was something about a freedom from those kind of protocols in helping me that made her sort of want to be generous with her time. So that was a bit of a kind of insight, I suppose, as to some kind of more metaphorical reason why these busy people in science or medicine or within these structures would want to work with an artist, or at the very least to help artists realise projects. After I left that department, she had given me all the statistics that were possible before going on to only concentrating on the face. So after that, there was various routes to go down, but I ended up at a facial reconstruction expert, also in forensics, based at the Manchester Metropolitan University. So this was just before Meet the Ancestors and all these programmes where we're now very familiar with this technique of facial reconstruction. So what the guy did, and his work was mostly with archaeological specimens, but like Sue, he would sometimes work on police cases, but only, as he said, in a case of very, very last resort. So he worked with a series of scientific charts and measurements. He took a plaster cast of my skull, of the skull, and then through working with clay, building outwards from the very deep facial muscles outwards, basically to the depth of these markers that he'd put into the skull. The very last moment was wrapping round a kind of clay skin, and it was a bit of a eureka moment where then an image appeared. But a parallel with what Sue was saying, this kind of moment where there's a kind of happy meeting of scientific process and artistic ideals. He said that the very, very last moment he has to leave all his charts behind because he's got to finish off the nose, he's got to decide on the thickness of the lips, he's got to think about hair, eyebrows. And these were moments that he described to me as being moments where he had to lose himself and let his intuition, artistic intuition, take over from the scientific methodology. So that was of great interest in me kind of identifying for myself what was interesting for me in these kind of processes. So as part of the exhibition itself, not only did I share this journey through images, all the documentation that I'd taken, but the people who'd helped me came and gave lectures and demonstrations as part of my exhibition. I also took members of the public on tours to places like the anatomy department and also the police museum, these places where I had found inspiration and been challenged by the exhibits, but normally were not open to the public. So the actual exhibition itself was an unfolding of the process that I described. I installed a series of porta cabins in the space, which made it a lot more intimate. In the first one, I had a table not much bigger than this with the box of bones on it. There was an attendant sitting in the corner, and the public could, if they wanted to, take the bones out and look at them. And then in the next 2 or 3 porta cabins that were in the space, the story unfolded of the process that I'd gone through, with the last porta-cabin being a bronze bust. I cast this kind of still unidentified person in bronze, and just had it was full of pathos, really, just had these bold statistics that the osteologist had uncovered. So they said age 25, height 5'2", Asian, although that was a bit of a kind of politically difficult piece of sort of description, which we talked about at great length, and then this phrase, at least one advanced pregnancy, which she was able to identify by looking at the hip bones. So once you got to that end point, most people would then go back to the box of bones, and I must say it was quite a different feeling when you'd been on this same journey as me and you came back to look at the skeleton again. It had changed from that. Well, I guess many people who are involved had been through art school have seen many an old skeleton hanging up in life rooms, and so there was a bit of a blasé attitude often at first, but that did change after seeing the exhibition. Oh Lordy, I'm going to have to really cut down on all the things I was going to talk about. I suppose another interesting thing to reflect on over the last 20 years of considering this body of work is the societal influence, the context of what was happening out there in the world, the growth of scientific debate, and how that influenced my decisions on how to make works, whether they were reflecting on that, responding to that. An example of that would be, for example, the Alder-Hay organ scandal that in the late 1990s, as I know you know, that sort of blew up around Bristol Royal Infirmary. As I'm sure you remember, a mother whose child had died during heart surgery asked for her infant's medical records. She found in those records a letter from the pathologist to the surgeon which stated that the daughter's heart had been retained. Eventually the hospital did return that, but it led to a public outcry and a public inquiry which brought to light that hundreds and thousands of body parts from infants and stillborn babies and fetuses were stored throughout the UK. It also led to the Human Tissues Act 2004 and the creation of the Human Tissue Authority, with many new regulations about donating organs and bodies for dissection, and also new rules about the display of human remains in museums and galleries, which has directly had repercussions for the kind of works that I have been interested in. The willingness of anatomy departments to help me, because that continued to be something that I did throughout those 20 years, was to ask for help or work collaboratively with people in anatomy departments. I don't know if you remember this thing that happened. In 1998, an artist called Anthony Noel Kelly, who was working at the Royal College of Surgeons in London, he was accused, along with the mortician, of stealing body parts to cast for sculptural works. So that was the first prosecution for stealing body parts in the UK since the Anatomy Act of 1832. He was sentenced to 9 months imprisonment, as was the lab technician that he was working with. Part of what he said in court was that the body parts were not being treated properly at the Royal College of Surgeons. They were all sometimes disposed of in incinerators, and he felt that what he did was something to do with bringing to light an identity that may have been part of the work that I just described. But in my opinion, I felt that what he did was wrong, to be very simplistic about it, but I was beginning to think about the reasoning for that was because the work itself was really, really rather bad. And how did those value judgments, how could they influence what was ethically permissible or not? I'll quickly describe a work at the other end of my career, which is from 2011 and which led directly to me applying for the job as Baltic Professor. I made a work called Cast from Nature. It was inspired by a fiberglass cast which is in the Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh, in the museum there. It's, as I say, it's a fiberglass cast with a label on it which says Cast from Nature, 1845. It's a, what do they call it? Écorché. It's a very, very aesthetically posed sculpture of a dissected body which has been cast. Originally it was cast in plaster, but this one on display was cast in fiberglass. And if you can conjure up the pose of the dead Christ in the Michelangelo's Pieta as he lies prostrate across the Virgin Mary's knee, that was the pose. So a really extreme pose with a dissection to the neck, jaw and chest. The label on it said Cast from Nature 1845 by Sir John Goodsir, the conservator of the Museum of the Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh 1841, the Professor of Anatomy in the University of Edinburgh 1846 to 1867. So that was an important time because it was right after the dark days for Edinburgh anatomy of Burke and Hare, the resurrectionists digging up material to give to the burgeoning anatomy schools, which led eventually to the Anatomy Act being passed in 1834, which said that it was legal to dissect a body that had been unclaimed, unidentified and unclaimed. So this stopped the practice of grave robbing or killing to order as practiced by Burke and Hare. I really wanted to know about the person who was the subject of this cast. So I started asking lots of questions: who they were, why they were posed in this way, who had the anatomist done the casting, had an artist done the casting. So the answer to all of these things was, we don't know, records are lost, we don't have any records. So, of course, this didn't put me off. It was just, yes, this is the work for me. So eventually, through a lot of connections, I did track down a plaster cast version of this sculpture. It had been lying for at least 35 years in the basement of the medical school in Edinburgh University. All its limbs, all its extremities were broken off, completely covered in dust. And as I say, the person who led me to it said in the 35 years he'd worked there, it hadn't been touched. The story of it was that it had been on display at one point and that it had been taken off display due to a flood, and in this process limbs had been broken. So he was thankfully happy for me to take this as the starting point of this project, because it wasn't precious, I guess, and also because it was bringing it literally from a basement out into the light. What I decided to do with it was partly due to the fact that I was in residence at Glasgow Sculpture Studios. So what I set up was a process where I would reattach the extremities, because thankfully they hadn't been lost, and then I would make a complete new cast of this plaster cast. So that was partly to try to slow things right down in a way, so that both myself and the audience would very, very slowly over this 3-month process that it took to make this cast. It's a really big undertaking. I did have some lovely assistants, but it really sort of conveyed an aspect of performativity about both anatomy and casting. But it also, I suppose, brought me as close as I would ever come to the experience of the anatomist as well as the original artist caster. This was done in a casting studio, and it was beamed live into an arena that I built that was kind of based on the idea of an anatomy theatre. So people could drop in and just sit and watch on several screens, a monitor and a projection as this process was carried out. There was also, again, a series of talks and seminars and lectures around various, both art and scientific and historical and ethical issues associated with this project. There were talks every lunchtime. So what it was leading to, again, like that previous project I discussed, I wasn't really sure what the finished work was going to be like, but by this point in time I had learned to trust that the process would eventually lead me somewhere. And it was only at the moment where we had to flip the mould that we'd made. We took it off the original plaster, so it was made of vinyl and then a plaster shell. We had to take it off, bolt it all back together again, turn it upside down and pour the plaster in and start swilling it around to make a new cast, which was the only thing I knew I definitely wanted to do. But as soon as I saw it inverted, the answer to how I wanted to present the thing kind of came to me. So it was a very simple installation in the end, which showed 2 new casts, both of which were complete. They had the arms and legs reattached. One of them was just as the original had been, just in this Michelangelo's Pieta pose of the dead Christ. The other one was flipped upside down and presented legs akimbo. It really was an incredibly kind of triumphant, almost flying pose, in direct contrast to this really, dead. There's no other way of putting it. In contrast to the other pose. So of course it was hollow as well, and one of the things that I really liked about it was that although it was quite anonymous in many ways, my authorship was that all my handprints, where I had to smear the plaster into all the extremities, they were the things that were incredibly visible as you couldn't help but peer inside the empty shell of the piece. So in terms of what I found out about the subject, not as much as I had maybe thought that I might. Nobody came forward, although it did generate really a lot of publicity. The nearest I got to finding anything out about the subject was that my work was reviewed in The Lancet by a medical historian, Ruth Richardson. And she questioned the dates that were on the sculpture and said, I wonder if it isn't more likely to be the casting described in Goodsir's anatomical memoirs of a man dissected and cast in layers in the autumn of 1858, who was, in inverted commas, an Edinburgh carter of intensely whisky habit, who in a drunken state fell from his cart and died on the spot. He remained free from decomposition during 30 days, which was the time that it took to make the cast. So just to finish off of how that led me to applying to a job at Northumbria University, I reflected, as I said, on the aspect of performance in medicine. Of course, we're all familiar with early painting, very famous paintings of early surgeons and anatomists, and the kind of inherent performance of the anatomy theatre. I had previously looked at communication skills in medicine and medical education, so both skills where actor patients are brought in to rehearse very difficult, usually breaking bad news situations with students, and situations where clinical skills are practiced on simulated patients. So these are, in my opinion, ugly big bits of rubber, very bad figurative sculpture. So that was in direct comparison to the over-aestheticisation of this sculptural pose. An important part of the project was when the exhibition was over and done, I kept this casting studio and I worked on a 6-week special study module with medical students who had opted to take a module which is kind of giving them the option to step out with the usual curriculum. So these students had opted for a module in medical humanities. And during that whole time, they worked with me just as if they were art students, really, in the casting studios. We talked about ideas for them making work. We went through small casting processes. It was pretty challenging. It was really important that what they were doing was making. It was an intensive time where they had to think on their feet constantly. Whenever you try to make something, it never turns out the way that you expect, whether you're an artist or a medical student. So the thing that got articulated during that time that they learned, probably they won't use many of their skills, casting skills, when they graduate, but the thing that they focused on that they found really useful, and as I'd hoped, was that they talked about how they learned to tolerate ambiguity, which is, of course, an enormously important thing to do. We sometimes want our doctors to be very black and white and right and wrong as they diagnose, but of course diagnosis has nothing to do with that. It's all about finding a middle ground, and that was what they articulated as being incredibly important about their experience. So when this job came up, I was reflecting on all the research and research questions that had been raised during this work. There had been discussions and dialogues with sociologists, with ethicists, with anatomists, medical people, museum people, and ultimately what it led to was a piece of work in a museum that got very well reviewed, but it was just a big but. There was so much generated that as I moved on to my next project, I kind of felt a great loss that all of that was whooshing, because I wasn't part of any academic structure where maybe a colleague would step in to take up some of the ethical questions. It felt to me that it would be really, really useful to be able to work a bit more formally as part of a team that I could build to be able to realise the full potential of this kind of practice. And the other thing was a realisation that although I and these medical students were, this is a bit petty, but although we were able to articulate, and part of what they did was do a public seminar to talk about this process, to do a slide presentation, to reflect on it, they also exhibited the pieces of work that they'd made at the opening of a brand new space within the hospital that was a new space called Creative Space for Art. So really an amazing journey that they came along. But their decision to do this module was treated with nothing but contempt from their lecturers, from all of the staff, I have to say, within the medical school. The things that were said to these young, amazingly bright young people about wasting their time, wasting their talents, it was absolutely shocking. And not only that, none of them had the good grace to even come to the exhibition or to hear these people talk about their experience and question it if they'd wanted to, but nobody came. And it made me think, I would like to take on this lot, but I wasn't doing any proper research. None of this was going to be published. I was just a crazy, loony artist. I wasn't taken terribly seriously when I hung out in the cafe and tried to sort of challenge them on this. So I thought I'd like to see if there was any difference by becoming a professor. So I haven't gone on to describe any of the things really that I've done since I started. I could if you want, but I'm conscious of time. Maybe, when we have a discussion, some of that will come out, how I've built on those, the experience of my practice to try to push these kind of questions around interdisciplinary practices, looking at, focusing on the body, trying to create a debate that's open to the public about these kind of, I think, incredibly interesting and relevant situations, not only within art or within academia, but within society. So I'll leave it there.
Cafe Culture North East is supported by Newcastle University, Peels and the British Science Association. We're also supported by Ginger's Cafe in Dance City, who host the events.